If you've ever watched Always Sunny, then you know it's not a show about good people. The gang are really the only ones in the show that don't have an issue with the gang. From their point of view, they're the good guys in the story. But we, the all-seeing, all-knowing audience, are in on the joke. They're definitely not the good guys.
This is dark.
Darkest thing we've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, 10K Bill here, your 14th favorite YouTuber and best friend. If the gang was truly irredeemable, then why would anyone still watch? Sure, they're awful humans, but sometimes their hearts are in the right place. Kind of. Or at least their hearts aren't necessarily in the wrong place sometimes. Despite their flaws, they still manage to worm their way into our collective heart. Charlie is the simple and lovable one. Mac is the confused one. Dee is the underappreciated underdog. And Frank is Danny DeVito. Need I say more?
Can I offer you a nice egg in this trying time?
You may be thinking, didn't I leave someone out? Okay, maybe you're not because you most likely read the title of the video before clicking on it. So you know exactly where I'm going with this. Dennis Reynolds was never exactly a lovable character, or a good guy in any way. An obvious narcissist, but largely harmless, right? That's the joke, isn't it? Oh, ha ha ha, Dennis is a serial killer, but like, not actually though.
Tools! Tools! Duct tape, zip ties, and gloves! I have to have my tools!
Dennis isn't a serial killer, right? He wasn't always this bad, was he? None of the gang were really. Charlie used to be smarter, Frank was cleaner. Over the course of the series, the gang started drifting further and further into their archetypes, losing some of the nuance that they used to have. Dennis maybe more than most. It can be hard to imagine now, but before Frank became a permanent member of the cast, Dennis was something of a straight man. He ran the bar and was the voice of reason on occasion. Sure, he was still self-centered and certifiably narcissistic, but it was just a funny joke to say he was a sociopath capable of committing murder. But somewhere along the way, his character started to go off the rails, so to speak. This is a phenomenon known as flanderization, something we've talked about quite a few times on this channel already. To keep it brief, it's the process of a few character traits becoming more and more exaggerated. So let's take a look at his journey and a few of the traits that may have contributed to this in a way that I hope Dennis would be proud of. When thinking of Dennis, there are a few words or phrases that might come to mind when describing him. But when describing himself, there's one specific phrase that Dennis is likely to use.
I am the golden god of this place! I reign supreme! I...
Saying that Dennis has a god complex might be a little too on the nose. His narcissism has become one of his most defining traits, but in many of the earlier seasons of the show, we saw some different traits from him, which could honestly be different sides of the same coin. We've seen some vulnerabilities from Dennis a couple times throughout the series. In the Season 2 episode, The Gang Exploits a Miracle, Dennis thinks he looks a little fat during a brief interview on TV, and develops an eating disorder that lasts for several days. It's rare to see this crack of vulnerability in Dennis's ego. We see through his outer shell less and less as the show goes on, and Dennis gets more confident, or at least appears to be more confident. And no episode better exemplifies the change in how Dennis's narcissism manifests than how Mac got fat. This episode features Dennis taking more and more drastic actions to keep up with how he thinks others view him, the peak of perfection. We see Dennis sort of switch more into what he'll eventually become, a narcissistic golden god with just a glimpse of self-doubt that is brought up less and less. This of course involves Dennis dyeing his hair black and butchering a chemical peel on his face. We do still see glimpses of Dennis's need for other people to accept him as he sees himself throughout the series, but we rarely see him displaying any kind of self-doubt from this point onward. And I think that's an important distinction. For instance, in the gang group dates, Dennis is continuously being ranked lower and lower on a dating site, eventually reaching the bottom tier of being ranked 1 star despite the fact that both Mac and Charlie are rated higher than him, and one of them typically reeks of cheese. Which I guess could be a good thing depending on who you're talking to. Dennis obviously views this as everyone else being wrong.
I mean, half a star? It doesn't change the 5-star man who he is. I'm a 5-star man! I'm a 5-star man!
After all, there can be no faults in a god. Speaking of which, Dennis's god complex is something that we've seen grow throughout the series as well. We've used the clip of Dennis referring to himself as a golden god already, so I won't play it again, but as the series has progressed, that's become less of a joke about Dennis's delusions of grandeur, and has become more what he actually seems to believe. In fact, we see Dennis confront himself while in a sensory deprivation chamber, and Dennis comes to the conclusion that he is, in fact, God. Or maybe just God of his own reality. But for Dennis, who has been shown to be an unreliable narrator and often warps his own memories, it's hard to tell what the difference might be to someone like him. So, yeah, it's hard to try and talk about Always Sunny without bringing some of this up, but when talking about Dennis, it becomes borderline impossible. So this is your warning for acts of physical violence, crimes of sexual nature, and just all-around degeneracy. Dennis isn't exactly shy about what he does when people aren't around.
Yeah, you are, because if the girl said no, then the answer obviously is no.
No.
But the thing is she's not gonna say no. She would never say no because of the implication.
But as the series has continued, the so-called implication kind of stops being just that. We've gone from Dennis might be doing some shady stuff to watching said stuff happen sometimes. The need for Dennis to toe the line, so to speak, has become more and more difficult as the proverbial line has continually been pushed back by the actual show. In the third season of the show, it's funny that Dennis resembles a registered sex offender on a poster that's been posted around the city. In season 8, it's funny that Dennis has a series of bench warrants for sexual misconduct. Not to mention, once again, the tools that he keeps in his car at all times. But in order to keep this video from being demonetized, I'll need to keep this part of the video relatively short. So, what's kind of weird about the dependence that Dennis has been nurturing is that it kind of goes a lot of different ways. The gang obviously has some major codependency issues, but many of these issues come back to Dennis, who is sort of like the keystone of the entirety of the gang. While Mac and Charlie would likely still be best friends if not for Dennis, they would certainly not be hanging out with Dee and Frank. Dennis has, whether he meant to or not, pulled this gang together. And knowing Dennis, he probably meant to in some way. Dennis has built this tiny community of people that he can actively monitor and control. This control is seen a few different ways through the series, my personal favorite being when Charlie and Dee hang out with each other and the gang misses the boat. Without other people, i.e. Dennis, controlling what they're doing, down to what they're eating, the two have a very hard time functioning. But this dependence is really most evident when it comes to Dennis and Mac. I think looking at the episode Mac and Dennis break up gives us a really good baseline for how they typically interact and intertwine their lives together. This episode actually does have the two realize that they're too dependent on each other, and the two briefly go their separate ways in order to gain more individuality. Unlike with the rest of the gang, Dennis isn't solely in charge of what Mac does. Mac also holds a lot of sway over Dennis. I mentioned codependence earlier in this part, and these two are very much the face of it. Dennis even kind of freaks out when forced to eat an apple with its skin because Mac doesn't like when you do that. You know, because of the toxins. Though Dennis still does try to control Mac from the shadows as much as he can in order to make Mac more dependent on him or to shape him how he'd like. Like how Dennis was secretly feeding Mac diet pills after tacking on Mass, or how Dennis started an entire cult for Mac to keep him from eating his Thin Mints. In fact, after Dennis leaves the gang for a bit, Mac finally gets absolutely shredded, which shows to me that the only thing really holding him back was Dennis. For someone who claims he doesn't have emotions, Dennis really has a solid grasp on other people's. At least most of the time. Aside from his overall disregard for, well, most people, there are a few select examples that I think do a pretty good job of giving you the broad strokes of this. Let's start with where we just left off, Dennis and Mac. In the episode Mac and Dennis move to the suburbs, Mac and Dennis move to the suburbs. They get a house that Frank is paying for, and the two are challenged to live there together, just the two of them, for 1 month. They're essentially sequestered together, with Dennis leaving for an hour drive every day to work, and Mac staying at the house just to kind of look after everything. We see the two of these characters begin to slowly unravel, with Dennis not giving Mac any kind of emotional relief in any way. While Dennis is going to work every day, Mac is staying home, alone, cut off. They do get a dog for a bit, but that doesn't end super well.
It's Dennis! What are you talking about?
You're eating the dog!
And while Dennis may or may not have wanted to just simply mess with Mac a bit during all of this, or he was just doing it without realizing, his self-described knowledge of general psychology has become a cornerstone of his character. We see this on display in Season 8's episode, The Gang Gets Analyzed. We find out in this episode that Dennis doesn't just keep tabs on what the gang does, he has full psychological dossiers on each and every one of them. He even started D's when he was in 2nd grade. Through his knowledge of how the rest of the gang will react to different situations and scenarios, Dennis is even able to guess what exactly Mac was doing during his session with the therapist. Aside from generally sociopathic actions, there's one thing that Dennis can typically be relied on for: grandiose rallying speeches that bring the entirety of the gang together or help teach them a lesson. Or at least that's how he views his speeches. Most of the time, Dennis is really inspiring hope within himself. He's building himself up constantly, whether as a 5-star man, a golden god, or a man who really hasn't even begun to peak.
Because I'm gonna peak so hard that everybody in Philadelphia is gonna feel it.
And as we said earlier in this video, the ways that Dennis speaks to and about himself has been growing in a borderline unsustainable manner. Truthfully, I really don't think anyone could stop this feedback loop if they wanted to. And even if they tried, they'd likely just end up on the wrong side of a Dennis meltdown, which is probably the absolute last place you'd want to be. So, I mean, this is kind of another obvious one, right? At the end of Season 12, Dennis decided to leave the gang behind and go raise his son in North Dakota. While he obviously returns the next season, there's definitely an ever-present threat that he could always just be gone again. What's weird about his absence, though, is how it affects everyone in the gang. Mac, as I said earlier, gets into the best shape of his life. Charlie has begun dating and is sick of the waitress, his long until now unrequited love. Dee has become a bit more confident and as a result has become more attractive to the opposite sex. And the bar as a whole is actually pretty successful. It seems like just not having Dennis around has allowed everyone to kind of flourish in their own right. There's a weird irony that Dennis, the golden god and the peak of humanity, was the reason that the gang was mostly unsuccessful in their endeavors. So has Dennis really changed? Kind of. I think it tends to be more of a scenario where as we spent more time with the character, we saw more and more of the cracks in the mask he wears start to form. Not too dissimilar from what the gang likely dealt with as they began to realize that Dennis was something of a sociopath. When rewatching the series, you can definitely see the seeds and hints at all these more, we'll say, extreme traits that we've come to associate with Dennis. But something that's been kind of in the back of my head as I was writing this is the fact that the character of Dennis might actually be using the Dennis system on us, the viewers. So far, we've seen Dennis demonstrate his value to us constantly. We've seen him engage physically many times. And by doing these, he's made us more seemingly dependent on him. So when his character finally left the show, we were emotionally neglected. But he did in fact return for the next season, which inspired hope in us all. And that's where we currently stand, waiting for the show to eventually end and Dennis to finally separate entirely from us.